Okay, continuing on in chapter 5, we're going to be talking today about connective tissues. We, in the previous module, talked about epithelial tissues. And I'll say the same thing with respect to connective tissues. We want to identify the various kinds that we will, of course, talk about in a few moments, and we'll be looking at in lab. And you want to know not only the different varieties of connective tissues, but again, where do we find them in the body and what do they do? A few common properties of connective tissue relates to the presence of what is referred to as extracellular matrix. Extracellular means this material lies outside of the cells of the connective tissue, as opposed to intracellular within. This is outside. And when you look at this material that lies outside of the connective tissue cells, it's referred to as the matrix. And there's a lot of protein within this matrix material and something called a ground substance. And what this matrix basically acts to do, as it mentions here, is a variety of functions depending upon what the connective tissue is. For example, if we talk about bone, which is a type of connective tissue, the extracellular matrix is made up of calcium phosphate that helps provide rigidity to the tissue. We all know, if we think about a bone, that it's hard, right? We know that the skeletal system supports us structurally. So in that particular instance, in bone, we have this matrix material composed of a lot of calcium and also collagen proteins that provides strength to that bone tissue. On the far extreme example of a matrix, where we go now from a very solid bony matrix to a liquid matrix like we find in blood. Yeah, blood is considered a connective tissue, even though it's a liquid or a fluid, which is kind of hard to wrap your mind around, I guess, but nonetheless, blood is a tissue. And the matrix, this material that lies outside of the red blood cells and the white blood cells and the platelets, you know what that's called. The plasma, which is primarily water, but there's also dissolved compounds in there too. So just remember, no matter what connective tissue we talk about, there is this extracellular material called the matrix that lies outside of the cells and between the cells and can vary in consistency, as it mentions here, from a fluid to a semi-solid to a solid. Another property of connective tissue cells is their ability to divide. And this is particularly important when we talk about what happens when there's an injury. We'll be talking about a particular type of cell in a few moments called the fibroblast. It's the most common type of connective tissue cell. And when you have a cut or an injury or a fracture or any sort of damage to the body, these fibroblasts are stimulated to divide to help manufacture this matrix material. They usually have a good blood supply, connective tissues. Not all, but most of them do. And this gets back to the idea that with an increased blood supply going to tissue, if there's injury, that repair process can happen typically quite quickly as the white blood cells come in, phagocytize the potential bacteria that might have been introduced with the wound, but also go about repairing the bone fracture or whatever the case may be. So it's very vascular tissue, connective tissue is generally. Okay, you heard me mention a few moments ago, the most common type of cell found in connective tissue is the fibroblast. And what these cells do is they secrete different types of protein fibers that become part of that extracellular material called the matrix. And here's an electron micrograph magnified 1,500 times of several fibroblasts. They're sometimes described as star-shaped cells. They're quite large. And again, the function of these fibroblasts is in secreting proteins into this extracellular matrix. Responds rapidly to injuries by increasing in number. And as we said a few moments ago, when there's tissue damage, these cells are among the first to arrive as they begin then to lay down more matrix. It goes about the repair process. A second fairly common type of tissue in connective tissue, or cell, I should say, in connective tissue, is the macrophage. Now, macro means large, phage means to phagocytize. So these actually are a type of white blood cell that will wander in and out and through connective tissues, so that if there happens to be any potential foreign invader there, they can identify that foreign invader and go about phagocytizing it, basically killing it if it's a bacterium or a tumor cell, whatever it might be. So they are extremely important scavengers as they clear foreign particles from tissues. So we often talk about their role in immunity, and we will do that when we get into the latter part of the semester in early December. The lymphatic system is our last system that we cover, and we'll talk more about macrophages, but they are basically a type of white cell, and they generally wander throughout the connective tissues, trying to keep them from any sort of bacterial or viral infection. And here's an interesting micrograph of a macrophage there phagocytizing another cell. I'm not sure what the other cell is there, but this macrophage is gobbling up, phagocytosis, you've heard of this before. I'm going to gobble that cell up, use its lysosomes to introduce enzymes to literally break that cell down. This is intracellular digestion we're talking about here. Perhaps it's a bacterial cell, or it could be a cell that's been invaded by virus. So this macrophage can identify the foreign cell, foreign invader, phagocytize it, kill it. Really important function. And a third major type of connective tissue cell is the mast cell. And mast cells do a number of different things, one of which, as it says here, is to produce and secrete heparin. If you've worked in the medical field, you probably have heard of heparin, often given to reduce or prevent blood clotting. Histamine, as it says there, promotes inflammation, which is actually not necessarily a bad thing. It's telling us that the body is fighting off some sort of injury. We'll talk more about inflammation when we get into the blood chapter. But to help you remember the role of histamine, let's think about what an antihistamine does. You've all had colds, or maybe you are in the midst of an allergy now with the fall upon us, or late summer. We have ragweed being secreted, right? Or in the spring of the year, the flowers are budding out, the grass is producing pollen and so forth, and we often come down with hay fever. So we will take oftentimes an antihistamine to relieve the runny nose, the watery eyes that accompany, hay fever, let's say, or maybe even the common cold. So antihistamine meaning to reduce the production of mucus. Histamine, of course, does just the opposite. It promotes the production of mucus and fluids, among other things too. That's not the only thing histamine does, but it's one of the major things histamine does. And you might wonder, well, why would you want to promote inflammation or promote mucus production? Well, in the case of, say, an allergic reaction to animal dander or pollen in the air, what have you, the watery eyes and the runny nose is the body's way of flushing the system to try to rid itself of the allergen. Yeah, so there's actually some benefits to inflammation. Although we often take anti-inflammatories too, so it just depends on how you look at it. And here's an interesting micrograph of this mast cell that secretes the heparin and the histamine. Very interesting. This is one cell. This isn't hundreds of cells. These aren't individual cells. This whole thing is a mast cell. Okay, let's remember, again, the most abundant cell type found in most all connective tissues is the fibroblast. And what the fibroblast does, as we said, was it helps in the process of injury repair. But one way that it does so is by producing some fibers. So we're going to talk now about fibers that you can find interwoven within the matrix of many types of connective tissues. I'm just going to list them 1, 2, and 3. The first one, the collagenous fibers, are the strongest of the 3. I often use the metaphor of if you've ever seen a driveway being poured, or a sidewalk being poured, or a foundation of a house being poured, you know that one way that the contractor can produce a really strong driveway, a really strong foundation for a house, is to reinforce it with rebar rod. So sometimes, you see just before the driveway gets poured, there's stone put down first, and then there's this metal rebar that runs in different directions. Typically, it's perpendicular to one another in big bars, right, that are wired together. And then the cement is poured, and the wire, again, rebar, is there to strengthen the cement. If you didn't have it, it wouldn't be as strong. So think of the collagenous fibers as often running parallel to one another in these long bundles. So a bunch of rebar rod, connected together, running down through the matrix. So this is going to provide a lot of strength and rigidity to certain types of connective tissues. A second type of fiber found in connective tissues is elastic. And as the name implies, this particular type of fiber can bend, sort of like a rubber band. Think of a rubber band. You stretch it, pull it, you leave go, it goes back to its original shape. These are not arranged in bundles like the collagenous fibers are. They're generally more kind of randomly interwoven within the matrix. So think of them again as being flexible. And our third type that we won't talk a whole lot about, we will mention it in one particular type of connective tissue, is the reticular fibers. And so these are thin collagenous fibers. They're like very, very thin rebar. So they're stronger than elastic, but not as strong as the bundles of collagenous, even though they technically are, but they're much thinner. And they generally are not oriented in parallel bundles. They're more kind of randomly interwoven within the matrix, kind of like the elastic fibers are. So here we see a photograph of both collagenous and elastic fibers. So let's talk about the collagenous first. In some of the older textbooks, they used to refer to it as white fibers. So when you look at your slide in lab, it might say white fiber. It might not. I don't remember exactly what the label is, but I remember seeing some slides that used to be labeled white fibers. These are those strong bundles of rebar. And you can see those, of course, here in gray. Very strong. And in yellow, we have the elastic fibers. Notice again, they're a little more randomly interwoven, not in those big, thick bundles like the gray, fibers are being shown here in the photograph. These are the rubber bands, if you will, that can stretch back and forth. So, in review, here we see again the 3 major cellular components of connective tissue, and of course, the extracellular matrix being composed of one or more of the fibers, either collagenous, elastic, or reticular, and then also within that matrix, this so-called quote-unquote ground substance that fills in the spaces around the fibers and among the various types of cells. Now this table, of course, lists a bunch of different kinds of connective tissues, and it looks a little daunting at first, but it really is not so bad. We're gonna be talking about each of these in some detail, both in lecture now and also when we get to this in lab. So you're gonna hear about it several times. And I think this, like the epithelial tissues, would lend itself well to flashcards as you begin to learn the names, where do you find them, and what do they do, right? So if you ever want to come back and see all the connective tissues in one fell swoop, you can check out that table in your book. It's on page 170, table 5.7. Great summary table. So let's talk about the various types, starting with the first, called the areolar connective tissue, or loose connective. Some of the books used to call it loose connective. So we have both an artist's sketch, of course, on the left, and a stained tissue section magnified with the microscope on the right. Again, the book is doing a good job showing us where in the body we find this. And so what do we got? What do we have in their areolar or loose connective tissue? Well, one thing to note is the presence of fibroblasts here, those kind of star-shaped large cells. We can see some of these here, stained kind of purple, although most of this is nucleus, but these cells are fibroblasts. But what is really easy to note is the presence of both collagenous fibers or collagen fibers and elastic fibers. The thicker pink stained fibers, like you see here and here and here and all over the place really, those are the strong collagen fibers oriented in bundles. And then the thinner purple lines you see here, those are the stained elastic fibers. So you can see again that they're interwoven within this three-dimensional space of the areolar connective tissue, and is telling us to look between the muscle groups and just under the skin. You can find loose connective tissue. If you've ever processed a deer or a cow or a pig, and you, in other words, if you butchered it, you would notice that between the muscle groups is this sort of slippery, snotty consistency material that we call fascia, or fascia, some people pronounce it. So that connective tissue between the muscle groups, that slimy, somewhat transparent, snotty material, that's loose connective tissue. Adipose tissue, another name for what? Fat, right? Fat. Adipose tissue, what do we have here? Well, adipose tissue is really interesting. The first thing to note is the presence of fat cells, or adipocytes, they're called. So you see one here, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one. So you've got several dozen fat cells in this particular histologic section, also here on the sketch. But I want you to note that the nucleus of each of these cells, and check out the diagram first, the blue colored nucleus is pushed to the very periphery of the cell, right next to the cell membrane, because what do you have in the middle here? This yellow material, what's that? Well, that's the triglyceride. That's the fat that's being stored by the fat cell. So as a fat cell fills with fat, its organelles, including the very conspicuous nucleus, gets pushed to the outer periphery, right next to the cell membrane. Okay, ordinarily in most cells, we'd expect to see the nucleus somewhere in the middle, right? And of course, if we had an electron microscope, we could identify all those various organelles as well. But that is not the case in fat. In fat cells, the nucleus and organelles get pushed to the edge because the majority of the cell, 95 or 99% of it, is containing triglycerides, fat. So in this histologic section, this white space that you're seeing is where the fat would be stored. Of course, you can see the thin cell membrane here. And then once in a while, you'll see a darker stained nucleus. Like there's one here, of course, it's labeled. Here's one, here's one, here's one, there's one, there's one. So every once in a while, if the knife happened to catch a cell at its nucleus, you're going to see it. But there may be some cells here where you don't see a nucleus. That doesn't mean they don't have one. It simply means when this tissue was cut or sectioned in preparation for the slide preparation, the knife simply did not catch the nucleus. Because remember, these cells are three-dimensional. So where do we find fat? Well, obviously in this particular diagram, we're looking at the skin, which we'll be getting into in chapter 6 next week. But in your dermis of the skin, in the deepest layer of the skin called the dermis, you find fat cells. So these cells kind of colored orange is where we find fat. So beneath the skin, we obviously have fat. Our kidneys are often packed in a lot of fat. On the surface of your heart, believe it or not, is a considerable amount of fat. You wouldn't probably assume that, but when we do the heart dissection in November, when we remove the pericardial sac, we might see some fat on it, but we'll also notice that once we get through that pericardial sac, that fibrous pericardium that's protecting and surrounding the heart, once we get through that and see the actual heart itself, we're going to see a considerable amount of fat in different strategic areas of the surface of the heart. So what's fat do for us? What's the benefit of fat? Well, there's a number of different benefits. It helps insulate us. It provides an important energy source. In fact, fat contains twice as much stored energy as either carbohydrates or proteins, which gets back to the idea that animals going into fall often will eat as much corn and various nuts. Think of deer, for example, or a squirrel. You know, they really try to maximize their energy intake, because what they're going to do with some of that organic material is they're going to, they're going to use it in cellular respiration to power their muscles, to move around and all that stuff. But they're also going to be taking that extra glucose and other proteins, and they're going to convert it into fat that can be stored in their body, so that when it starts to snow and it gets cold and the leaves fall off the trees and the snow buries the nuts and it's tough to find food, they can rely on those big, thick fat deposits that they built up over the fall. And if any of you, again, have ever processed a deer, for example, after you remove the hide, you see lots of fat on the surface, just above the muscles, just on the surface of the muscle groups. And that's why it's there. So cushioning also is another function of fat. We mentioned a moment ago that our kidneys are packed in fat. That's because our rib cage does not extend quite down far enough to protect our kidneys. And so we've evolved the protective mechanism of embedding the kidneys in a lot of fat. So protection, insulation, and energy storage are the three major functions of fat. Reticular connective tissue. This is the only connective tissue that we will talk about that has that third type of fiber that we mentioned earlier in that table, the reticular fibers, remember? Those we said were thin collagen fibers. And so here we're looking at the liver, right? We could also look in the spleen and find reticular connective tissue, which acts to support the organ. That's its major function. Those thin collagenous fibers, while thin, they still are strong, and they provide a rigidity. If you've ever tried to cut into a liver, a lot of people don't like to eat liver, so you probably have never done that or wouldn't do it anyway. But if you ever do, even with a sharp knife, it's hard sometimes to cut right through a piece of liver. That's because of these reticular fibers providing a lot of support to the organ. So in this artist sketch, we can see some of the fibers here in purple, these small little lines within the matrix. And then, of course, in the histologic section, we can see those, of course, as well as black lines randomly interwoven in between the fibroblasts. So you see several fibroblasts here, both in the sketch and in the photograph. So reticular connective tissue, liver, spleen. That's the only time we'll really talk much about reticular connective tissue. Dense, regular connective tissue. We're going to talk in the next slide about what's called dense, irregular connective tissue. So what's the difference? Well, in the case of dense, regular connective tissue, look at the sketch here the artist has made. We see some fibroblasts scattered around. But what are all these kind of wavy lines? Well, as it says here, collagen fibers. So this particular connective tissue has almost the maximum a number of collagen fibers one could pack into a small space. And again, this three-dimensional drawing kind of gives you a good sense of these cross-sectional views of all of these collagenous fibers. So it's 99% collagen, isn't it? And of course, the stained section here also illustrates those kind of wavy lines, kind of looks like permed hair a little bit. This is super, super, super strong. High tensile strength. Very, very strong. And of course, it's telling us to think about tendons and ligaments as to where to go to find dense, regular connective tissue. So what is the difference between a tendon and a ligament? Well, ligaments connect bone to bone, while tendons connect muscle to bone. So you should begin learning the difference. Ligaments connect bone to bone, tendons connect muscle to bone. Histologically, they're made up of the same connective tissue, which of course is dense, regular. So you would not be able to look at a microscopic section and say, oh, that came from a ligament or that came from a tendon. They would both look identical. Now, what you get in terms of strength and rigidity, you pay for in terms of ease of repair. Earlier, we said that most connective tissues are very vascular. What does that mean? Vascular. That means they have a lot of blood supply. But I made mention at that moment in time that there are some exceptions to the rule, and here is one, the primary exception to the rule. When we talk about dense connective tissues, they generally, at least the regular dense connective, does not get much blood supply. Therefore, if there is a ligament tear or a tendon injury, as we often see in professional sports, or even high school sports, you can have injuries, right, to tendons and ligaments, unfortunately. And those can follow you for the rest of your life, depending upon how significant the injury is. But the reason that they take so long to heal is because there's not a good blood supply nearby. And remember, blood is important because it carries not only nutrients to the tissue that the tissue is going to need as it repairs itself, but it also is going to carry the white blood cells to gobble up phagocytize potential pathogens, and RBCs carry primarily oxygen to the tissues. So if you don't have a good blood supply, it generally takes a lot longer to heal. Here's dense, irregular connective tissue that I made mention of a few moments ago. So don't mix up the two. What is the difference between dense regular and dense irregular? Well, the primary difference lies in the fact that dense regular, like we saw a moment ago, contains many, many, many bundles of collagenous fibers. It's almost exclusively bundles of collagenous fibers, densely packed together. In dense irregular, you have interwoven, more randomly distributed fibers. It's still collagenous fibers, okay, but they're not as densely packed together. And so it's telling us to go into the dermis. We were there not too long ago when we looked at fat, if you remember. In fact, in this particular histologic section of skin, here's fat down below. See these white structures? Those are the adipocytes, fat cells. But we're focused on the connective tissue of above that, and this is that dense irregular connective tissue. You also find it on the surface of bones. There's a membrane we'll talk about in another couple of weeks called the periosteum that covers the surface of bones. That's made of dense irregular connective tissue. So we do not have a slide of this. When we get to lab, we will not be really looking at this type of connective tissue. We'll look at dense regular, but I don't have any dense irregular to look at. Elastic connective tissue gets its name from the presence of lots of elastic fibers, not exclusively elastic fibers, because we see here also collagen fibers. But this particular type of tissue is both strong, right, thanks to the presence of collagen, but also what is it? Being elastic, it can stretch, yeah. So it has two things going for it: strength, yet flexibility. And we can see again several fibroblasts in this diagram. They're a little more difficult to see, I think, in the histologic section. Very difficult to see, in fact. But it's telling us to go and look where in the body. What is this? Anybody know? This is the heart, obviously. This is the aorta. The aorta. Now, we're not going to get into the heart until November, but I'll simply tell you that the aorta is the largest artery of the body. When blood gets ejected from what's called the left ventricle, it's sent to all regions of the body except the lungs. So it's got to get pumped to the tips of your fingers and the tips of your toes and everywhere in between. Therefore, the blood is being exerted under a great deal of pressure when it leaves the left ventricle and enters the aorta. There are a few major blood vessels that branch off the top. You see those three there. They feed up into the head and neck. But the vast majority of the blood makes the arc or arch and then heads on down. And then from there it gets spread out to different parts of the body. So this particular blood vessel needs to be able to flex and bend as blood gets exerted, into it with every heartbeat, but it also needs to be strong. And this is the perfect tissue to do that. Provide both strength and rigidity. Some regions of the respiratory air passageways also would have elastic connective tissue in it too. Now we move on to a cluster of connective tissues that we will refer to here as cartilage. Now, I think you've all heard of cartilage, but you probably didn't know that there were three different kinds of cartilage. And of course, you see those listed there: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. We're going to be looking at the three types in just a moment, but before we do so, I want to have you focus on that yellow box, which tells us that regardless of the type of cartilage we are looking at, all of them will have cartilage cells present called chondrocytes. And again, cyte means cell. Chondro refers to cartilage. And so these chondrocytes, found in all types of cartilage, are going to be housed in small little chambers, microscopic chambers, called lacunae. That's the plural term. If I was talking about one chamber, I would have to take off the E, and I would use the word lacuna. Okay, so lacuna, one chamber; lacunae, more than one chamber. They again house the chondrocytes. The extracellular matrix that lies between the chondrocytes, as it mentions there, very abundant. And it's going to vary depending upon which of the three types of cartilage we're talking about. So let's talk about the first one, hyaline cartilage. This is the one that you're probably most familiar with. It's telling us to look here near the sternum. In fact, where the sternum connects to the ribs, we have something called costal cartilage. Now, this isn't a fourth type. It's hyaline, but it gets the name costal because costal refers to ribs. Okay, so this is hyaline cartilage between the sternum and the ribs. You can also look at the end of your nose. You can look in the rings that comprise the tracheal wall that we know is lined internally by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Remember that from the other day? The ends of bones have hyaline cartilage on what we call the epiphyses, the ends. Think of a femur or a tibia or an ulna or a radius. On the ends of long bones, we have articular cartilage. Articular is not a fourth type. Articular means this is at a joint or articulation. It's hyaline cartilage. And then the last thing I'll mention about where you can find it is if you look at a fetus as it's developing, and even into infant and adolescent, and even into the teen years, we have hyaline cartilage that becomes ossified. And we're going to talk about that ossification process coming up in another couple of weeks. It's fascinating. But if you look at a fetus, it's got no bone at a particular stage of development. It eventually will form bone, but at some point in time, what becomes the future bone is at that moment in time in development, this type of connective tissue, hyaline cartilage. So what do we have here? Well, as promised, we have chondrocytes shown here in blue. Actually, their nucleus is very, very large. This is the lacuna that I was talking about earlier, this cavity or space within which you can find one or more chondrocytes. Now this sketch almost implies that there's one chondrocyte per lacuna, doesn't it? But sometimes, like here in the actual histologic stain section, here we have one lacuna, right? And we've got 4 chondrocytes inside. Or in this particular example, we may have one lacuna, but we have 2 chondrocytes with pink nuclei inside. So I generally say, when you talk about lacunae, you can have anywhere from 1 to perhaps as many as 4 chondrocytes present in each lacuna. Here is our extracellular matrix in dark purple on the sketch. In most histologic sections, they use particular stains and dyes that will impart almost a pinkish or whitish look to the extracellular matrix. And you'll be seeing that coming up soon when we look at this in lab. Like dense connective tissue, cartilage generally does not have a direct blood supply, which is why when you have cartilage tears, it takes so long to repair. And these chondrocytes don't generally like to undergo cell division unless they absolutely have to. So between the lack of vascular supply and the fact that these chondrocytes are difficult to trigger into undergoing cell division, injuries to cartilages like dense regular connective tissue tend to take longer. Here's our second kind of cartilage, elastic. Again, chondrocytes in lacunae. However, what we see here that we didn't see in hyaline cartilage is the presence of elastic fibers throughout the matrix. So in between the lacunae, we have elastic fibers. Now, what do the elastic fibers provide this type of tissue? Well, think back to elastic connective tissue of the aorta. Yes, it was strong, it had collagen, but what did we say the elastic fibers provided? Remember? Stretchability, right? Bendability. As that blood got pumped through the aorta, it was being pumped under a great deal of pressure, so the walls of the aorta had to be able to give and take. So in this particular instance, we have that same idea, although it's just elastic here. There's no collagen. And so this particular type of cartilage has to be able to stretch and bend. And it's saying go to the ear, right, to look for it. You can take your ear and you can bend it, stretch it, and it goes back to its original shape. That's due to the elastic fibers within the matrix of elastic cartilage. And it's telling us to look where in the body? Well, other than the ear, it's saying you can look here in the larynx, actually just above the larynx, we have something called the epiglottis. It's made up of this type of cartilage, so that when you swallow, this epiglottis, this little flap of cartilage, will fold back and food will go into the more posterior esophagus and be taken to the stomach. When you're done swallowing, the epiglottic cartilage reverts back to its original shape, and this reestablishes blood or airflow in and out of the lungs. Okay, so this is the trachea, and you can see the C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage right here. But again, we're talking in the epiglottis, elastic cartilage. So don't get them mixed up. Elastic cartilage can bend. It has to be able to stretch. And our last type of cartilage, oops, where is it? Where's fibrocartilage? Oh, okay, thought I must have accidentally erased it. Well, let's take a look in your book there on page 168, figure 5.27. Check it out. It looks somewhat similar to elastic cartilage, only in fibrocartilage, you don't have elastic fibers. In place of those, you have collagen fibers. So that's going to provide a lot of rigidity, a lot of high tensile strength, right? You're going to have chondrocytes and lacunae, just like you do for these other cartilages. But within the matrix, you're going to have these interspersed bundles of collagen fibers. And so they are extremely strong. Places to look for fibrocartilage would include the intervertebral discs. So between your backbone vertebrae, there are pads of fibrocartilage. When we talk about like a slipped disc, that's damage that has occurred to that particular disc made up of fibrocartilage. And like all these other cartilages, damage can take a while to repair. Sometimes people need surgery to repair slipped discs or discs that have been damaged. If you've ever heard of menisci in the knee joint, the lateral and medial meniscus. Menisci is plural, meniscus is one. These are small pieces of fibrocartilage between the femur and the tibia. So at the end of the femur, at the distal end of the femur, you have these condyles, these rounded structures that articulate with the proximal surface of the tibia. And if you didn't have those pads of fibrocartilage between the two ends of the bones would rub against one another, and that would be not only painful, but would eventually erode the bone. So the knee joint has a right and left meniscus, so that the condyle of the femur rests nicely in that piece of fibrocartilage. And then due to the presence of what's called synovial fluid, when you go to bend your knee, there you have a friction-free environment there between the bone and the meniscus. So more on that coming up in another few weeks as well. Sorry, I didn't have that slide. Bone, we talked about this not too long ago. This is the most rigid of the connective tissues because remember, in the matrix, we had lots of calcium. Now, it's not the only substance found in the matrix of bone. There's also collagen, a lot of collagen fibers, which we know are those rebar rods, right, in bundles. So here we have an artist's sketch of what's called compact bone. And this is a small little histologic section taken, let's say, from the femur or from the humerus. And we're looking at this under high magnification, so 200x. This is the actual photograph that you're going to be seeing in lab. And what we're looking at are structural units in compact bone called osteons. Okay, so osteon is a structural unit found in compact bone. Most of the bone in your body is compact bone. So you see one osteon here, here's another osteon, here's another osteon, here's another osteon. So these osteons are adjacent to one another. And here we see in this particular artist sketch, here's a part of one osteon, here's another one, here's another one. Each osteon has in its center something called a central canal. Runs down the very center of the osteon. So here's a central canal, here's a piece of one, here's a piece of one. Here we can see in black where the stain remained. This is a central canal or osteonic canal. Some books will use that term. The older books used to call it a Haversian canal. We'll stick with osteonic canal or central canal, I think is a better way to remember it. And then if you look really close, you see these sort of rings, kind of like rings of a tree, right? These rings are called lamellae. They basically define the matrix material made up of calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate salts, as well as collagen fibers. So the lamellae, the rings of the tree being the osteon, the rings of the tree, the rings of the osteon, the lamellae, contain calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate crystals, as well as collagenous fibers or collagen fibers interwoven within the matrix, all of which provide an extreme rigidity and strength to bone, as you probably already have figured out. Now, I do want you to think about the fact that most of us, when we think of a bone, we think of like the skeleton that was in lab, or a bone that sits in front of us on a lab bench, the femur, let's say. In you and me, our bones are very vascular. They have a blood supply to them. The bone on the skeleton sitting in front of you in lab, if you cut that with a saw, it's not going to bleed, obviously. So it's dry bone. So you have to kind of think about this a little bit. Each of these osteons in its osteonic canal, which you don't see the presence of these things now, you just see the hollowness of it. But in you and me, these osteonic canals would contain blood vessels and nerves and even some lymphatic vessels too. And so bone is very vascular. That's why a fracture can repair itself amazingly fast, because we have a good blood supply there. Okay, so keep that in mind. In the osteonic canal or central canal are blood vessels, nerves, and some lymphatic tissues. The other thing I want to point out here that's embedded within the lamellae, the rings of the tree, quote unquote, are the bone cells called osteocytes. Now remember, when we talked about chondrocytes, cyte means cell, chondro refers to cartilage. Well, what's osteocyte mean? Well, literally translated, bone cell. So we're going to take one of these little bitty, looks like a spider, doesn't it? Let's take one of those little spiders, or one of these little bitty spiders, and let's blow it up. And so in the bottom of this slide, we see magnified 6,000 times with an electron microscope, a single osteocyte. That's what is shown right here. This is an osteocyte. It is housed within a chamber called a lacuna. So just like chondrocytes are found in lacunae, 1 to 4 chondrocytes per lacuna, we have bone cells. And it's usually a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 osteocyte per lacuna. Okay, so the space or cavity within which the osteocyte resides is the lacuna. I want you to note that emanating from this osteocyte are small little cytoplasmic extensions. They label them here cellular processes. These little cytoplasmic extensions will run through the lamellae. There are small little hollow tubes called canaliculi that accommodate these cellular processes of the bone cells. So I want you to try to picture this. We have this osteocyte in its lacuna, and then sticking out from the cytoplasm, really an extension of the cell membrane, are these processes that extend into the matrix, into the lamellae. So this little line you see would accommodate one of these cellular processes. And you have a whole bunch of these emanating all over the place in a three-dimensional way out from the center of the cell. And you can kind of get the impression that when you look at this under the microscope, these little canaliculi, these little hollow spaces in the lamellae that accommodate the cellular processes, these canaliculi come into close contact with canaliculi from an adjacent osteocyte. So pretend my fingers are the little hollow tubes, minute little tubes in the lamellae. And this is coming from one osteocyte, this is coming from an adjacent osteocyte, and they kind of like do this. They don't touch, but they get really, really close. And so this is how you get nutrients moving throughout the entire osteon. They emanate or originate here in the blood vessels, in the arteries and veins held in the central canal, right? And then through the process of diffusion, nutrients and also gases like oxygen will diffuse through those canaliculi and among the canaliculi from cell to cell to cell. So the cells, let's say, of this particular osteon, on the very edge of our osteon, how does this cell get oxygen? How does this cell get glucose to undergo cellular respiration? How does this cell get amino acids to make protein? Well, it gets all these necessary nutrients as a result of diffusion that starts here in the blood vessels housed in the central canal. And then this gets passed from cell to cell to cell to cell via those canaliculi. Pretty amazing. And likewise, when this cell at the very edge of the osteon generates CO2, right, a waste gas, which we know is produced primarily in the citric acid cycle, right, chapter 3, that waste product gas is going to diffuse from an area of high concentration toward an area of lower concentration and be taken away via the vein that's housed in the central canal. So it's an amazing process. We'll be reviewing this again when we get into the skeletal system coming up in a couple weeks. So bone, most rigid of the various connective tissues. And now we have the most liquid of the connective tissues. I mentioned this earlier, the blood. Yeah, the blood's matrix we called what? Plasma, right? The plasma of your blood, which is a straw-colored fluid made up primarily of water, 92% water. This extracellular matrix plasma bathes the blood. It's outside the cells, it's extracellular. And in terms of the primary cell types, I think you all know the three basic cell types of blood, I hope you do. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. We'll be spending an entire chapter on blood. So look in any blood vessel, look in a capillary, look in a vein, look in an artery, right? That's where blood is, obviously. These blood cells are manufactured in our red bone marrow, and also actually our lungs can produce some of these cells as well. But most of the time we think of red bone marrow. The white blood cells here have a nucleus, so they're nucleated cells. Red cells don't have a nucleus. Kind of interesting. White blood cells are important in fighting infection, right? They phagocytize other cells. Some white cells do that. Many cells do that, white cells. Red blood cells primarily function in transport of oxygen and to some extent some CO2 to and from tissues. And platelets, maybe you know, are associated with blood clotting, although they don't actually help blood clot. They contribute to the mechanism of the stoppage of bleeding. But again, we'll get into this in another month or two. They form what's called a platelet plug. So if you want to think of them as assisting in blood clotting for now, you can, but really blood clotting is a very different mechanism of which platelets kind of peripherally participate in that process, but they do stop the bleeding. Okay, we're going to stop here. We just have 3 or 4 other slides to look at to wrap up chapter 5, so we'll do that coming up in the next module.